Welcome back to the coffee house. 40 films, 70 years, 4 eras, all in the pursuit of reviewing each adventure. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the coffee house, where today's video is going to serve as the kickoff for the first arduous endeavor ever, reviewing every Godzilla film ever made. I've always been a lifelong fan of Godzilla, and as I continued into my adult life, that admiration only grew stronger, especially with some of the more recent installments of the monster. Now, before we begin, let me lay out a few things. The first thing I want to go over is that Godzilla is broken down into 4 separate eras, at least the Japanese versions are, and those eras are the Showa era from 1954 to 1975, the Heisei era from 1984 to 1995, the Millennium era from 1999 to 2004, and the Reiwa era from 2016 to present. Each of these eras are named after the Emperor's reign at the time. However, obviously that changed with the turn of the millennium, hence the name given. Additionally, the American productions of Godzilla also have its own eras, with the infamous TriStar era being from 1998 to 2000, named after its producing studio and that terrible film that it produced, and the recent MonsterVerse era from 2014 to present. Just keep that in mind as we go throughout these films. However, I'm sure a lot of us got into this with the Japanese versions of the movie, more so than the American ones. However, if you're a person that got into Godzilla with the American versions and went back for the Japanese ones, then that's awesome and more power to you. Furthermore, for each of these videos, I'm specifically going to be focusing on the TOHO creations of Godzilla in the early stages, watching every subversion of these films that I can get my hands on. I wanted to try and watch each of these films as they were originally released, avoiding any cuts or edits like the American versions of some of these films. However, if that's the only thing that's available, then I'll make that known. Also, yes, I will adventure to the more recent MonsterVerse installments of the iconic Godzilla 2000 as well. I'm not only staying in TOHO territory as these films progress. Additionally, some of these films are a bit difficult to find, mainly the original Godzilla vs. Kong, which I still can't seem to get my hands on any streaming service. And additionally, yes, I'm also going to be reviewing the Mothra and Rodan films as well, seeing as those are technically canon to the Godzilla films and even cross over into that timeline. Furthermore, for all my Gamera fans, I'm not going to be reviewing any of those films as part of this series. I've actually never seen any of those films, so that might be a nice rabbit hole to jump into after this. We'll see. Lastly, I'm also going to be ditching the coffee pairings for each of these videos and moving them to more of a short form content. It's just hard to sustain in each video, and I found it not being the form that I wanted it to be in, so be on the lookout for those on the channel at some point down the road. For each of these videos, we're going to be tackling them in 4 separate sections. We're going to be having a brief overview of the characters to establish who they are in order to speak about them more freely. Then we'll transition into the plot, discussing all of the story beats and events, so expect spoilers for a 70-year-old film. We'll then transition into the monster or monsters, discussing how they're portrayed and their design. Then after that, we'll discuss each film's music, and then finally we'll dive into my overall thoughts on the film and what I see in it. I'll also be ranking every single one of these on a tier list at the end of each video. But rest assured, these are steeped in my own personal preference, so feel free to keep whatever film you like at the top of your list. If that's Godzilla 2000, more power to you. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and begin this adventure off right with 1954's classic, Gojira, or Godzilla. Godzilla 1954 was directed by Ishiro Honda and written by Shigeru Kayama, along with Takedo Mura. And not only is Honda going to be a name that we're going to become very familiar with, but writer Kayama will be as well. Additionally, these films feature a cast that would be so iconic to the series that some of its actors would go on to star in subsequent sequels while inhabiting different roles. Firstly, we have Akira Takarata as Hideko Ogata. Then we have Haruo Nakajima and Katsumi Tezuka as Godzilla. Yes, Godzilla used to be a man in a suit, but more on that later. Next, we have Momoko Koichi as Emiko Yamai. Then we have Takashi Shimura as Dr. Yamai. And finally, we have Akihito Hirata as Dr. Shirazawa. If I butchered any of those names, I'm sorry. Not only are these actors iconic, but their presence is what adds to the charm of Godzilla, giving each film a sense of character and having them be staples of the franchise. And speaking of these characters, let's go ahead and get into the characters. I want to lay out who each person is, giving myself the freedom to speak about them at a later time. It just makes it easier. This movie has loads of characters, some major, others minor, but for posterity's sake, I'm going to list them now so that I can refer to them later in the video. The character that we have is Dr. Yamai. He's a straightforward man and a well-renowned paleontologist who will become integral to this film's plot, and is the direct contact to the Japanese government. He sort of starts off as our main character, but steps out of that spotlight as the film progresses, because that void gets filled by the second character and in Imiko, Dr. Yamai's daughter. She's a soft-spoken and passionate person who is also a nurse that tends to a lot of the survivors throughout this film. The movie is largely told through her perspective, and she's going to become our main character as the story progresses. The third character I want to go over is Ogata, a confident and suave man who is also Emiko's love interest and a sailor slash steamship captain. He has a few ships that are lost to this weird anomaly in the sea, and we see how that plays out in this film. We should also note that Dr. Yamai doesn't really care for Ogata, and instead already has his sights set on his daughter marrying the next character, character number 4, my man, Dr. Shiwazawa. The coolest son of a bitch you have ever seen in Emiko's past love interest. Not only is he one of the best Goro Majima impersonators, but he's also a shut-in scientist who fears the government and all of its power. He's a brilliant scientist who is also the hero of this story, but serves as a representation on the fear of atomic war from the human perspective, in addition to what further catastrophic inventions like the atomic bomb could do to the world. So, with all the character introductions out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the plot. For me, this plot begins 9 real years before Godzilla's debut, starting in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan in 1945. For those that live under a rock or were too proud to pay attention in history class, the entire world was wrapped up in this little known event called World War II. I really don't think I need to provide a history lesson here. Although this war lasted over many years, with so many historical events and tragedies transpiring, it's the tale at the end of World War II that is the most important to the story, when America dropped 2 nuclear bombs onto Japan in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, resulting in catastrophic devastation and loss of 70,000 people with the first bomb, according to the National Archives, and an additional 35 to 40,000 with the second. This was Hiroshima before the bomb, and this was them after. Additionally, this was Nagasaki before the bomb, and this was them after. I know you're here for a Godzilla video, and I don't mean to hit you with the cold water, but this historical context and devastation is important to Godzilla's history, and is the whole reason that this creation even exists in the first place. Not only is Godzilla's creation supposed to symbolize this notion of atomic fear, but it's everything that the atomic bomb represents. Something that was created by the fires of war, something uncontrollable, and something that wreaks unknowable havoc wherever it goes, devastating everything and everyone in its path, regardless of class, race, and gender. Just an almighty, unstoppable force with no barriers to contain it, or a godly creation among mortal men. These single events would devastate Japan as a nation and strike fear upon the world stage, but it would result in a question and lifelong journey for the world as technology began and still is advancing. What happens when everyone has access to this world-ending power, and how does humanity decide when it should be used, if at all? And it's with that emotion and that historical experience that we find ourselves at the title card of 1954's Godzilla. As we begin this film, we start with a fantastic use of foreshadowing. We are greeted by a Navy ship near Oda Island that is under attack by an unknown threat. It's one that we don't see, but we can feel. We know this because we see what it's capable of thanks to the devastation it's causing on this Navy ship. Throughout this attack, the crew immediately sends out an emergency distress call for backup when the unfortunate befalls these sailors, and the ship itself succumbs to the damage inflicted on it. It's not a very hopeful way to start the film, but there are survivors. It's a great use of foreshadowing as we are immediately set up against a threat that we cannot see, but we understand the presence it has and what it is capable of. It's a great use of tension building and really sets the audience up for the mystery in terms of what this threat actually is. As we progress further, we end up seeing the aftermath of this Navy accident as well, being in the office of where the distress call was sent to. We see the families of these sailors being present. Not only are they begging for answers as to what happened to their family members, but they're intelligent characters in their own right. And I really want to talk about this for a second. I know that this is a small thing that may get overlooked throughout the film, but I really love this film's use of extras. I know that the roles they play are really small, such as the family members or the Navy victims or the townspeople of Oda Island, but they ask very poignant questions in regards to the situation and even rebel against the information they are given in order to fully understand the situation. It is a fantastic use of world building and a wonderful display of character intelligence. I love this because it makes each scene feel full and like it inhabits the world with real people and not just characters playing a part. Additionally, in this scene in particular, it makes the Navy victims' lives feel so palpable. Like they weren't just some random people dying and nobody cares. The deaths of these men have weight, and we see the lives it affects, leaving their family members to worry and search for answers. Additionally, the film also puts us right into their shoes as well, wondering what we just experienced and asking questions just as if we were the victims' families. It is a great use of perspective in filmmaking that furthers the tension while also aiding in the mystery of what is transpiring. It's great stuff. I just really felt like I needed to highlight that. Back to the plot. It's also with the sinking of this ship that we meet Emiko and Ogata for the first time. Not only do we get a nice introduction into their relationship, but we get a feel for who they are as a couple as well. Very much in love, but keeping those feelings close so as to not interfere with their work. Additionally, we get the notion that Emiko keeping her feelings for Ogata a secret from her father, having Ogata question as to if Emiko has informed him yet or not. It's a nice dynamic that has some weight to it, in addition to introducing us to our main protagonist. Throughout this time period, we end up getting more shots of Oda Island as well, in addition to seeing the fish supply from Oda Island begin to dry up, having an older man say that this is Godzilla's fault. Keep that pinned. That night, however, we're introduced to a young boy named Shigechi and his family. However, this introduction is short lived, as a massive typhoon begins to overtake Oda Island. We see lots of heavy winds, destruction, and objects just being torn to shreds. We're meant to believe that this is some crazy typhoon rolling in, but we know that this is the force that has been called Godzilla, and still up to this point remains unseen. Throughout the storm, though, we get Shigechi's perspective as he sees something that we cannot, something that horrifies him throughout this entire scene. And as we bear witness to this horror, his family and home get crushed by an unknown force, and he is left alone. Not only is this part of the movie strange because it makes it seem like Godzilla can just create typhoons, but in my own headcanon, I like to classify this as Godzilla's final transformation into the creature he would become. But that's just me. That is just my own complete theory. Furthermore, this event goes on to further the horror that is this unknown force named Godzilla. Not only do we see it destroy a Navy ship, but now we get the destruction of a small town and residents within it. It's a simple level up to a destructive force that still remains unseen and further adds to the tension and weight of this being. Additionally, it keeps the audience on their toes as to what this monster could be, keeping the intrigue at an all time high. I love it. After this, though, we get our first real encounter with a creature of insurmountable proportions, having made it to the shores of Oda Island when our group of characters, Dr. Yamai, Emiko, and Ogata, travel to Oda Island to assess a shipwreck that has landed on their shores. Not only did the Japanese government send Yamai here because of Shigechi's testimony as to what he experienced, but it also serves as a great location for each of our characters as they all would have a vested interest in being here. It's a fantastic use of writing and storytelling that really brings all of our main characters together. Not only is Yamai the seasoned doctor and elder statesman of the cast, but serves to assess the biological damage and assessment of what this creature could be. Ogata is there to investigate the missing ships and what is happening near those shores, in addition to wanting Yamai's approval and supporting Emiko. And lastly, but most importantly, Emiko is here as the emotional linchpin for our audience, assisting those that have been displaced by this creature and offering her support, but also being the ones whose eyes we see the devastation through. It is a wonderful set piece that perfectly sets the scene for the rest of the film. Once we get there, our characters can be seen assessing a gargantuan radioactive footprint. A footprint that we know, as referred to earlier in the film by our older man, belonging to the fearsome Gojira or Godzilla. Okay, really quick. I want to pause it right here for a second. I want to talk about this old man for a second. Because for a character that is as minor as he is, boy, is he sure filled with so much exposition and history in just a few lines that he's given. This older man states that he has history with this creature. He is the one that name drops it for the first time. And the Godzilla that he is referring to, from what he tells us, was a sea creature off the coast of Oda Island, this very island, that needed a female sacrifice sent out to sea for it in order for it to provide the people of Oda Island with fish. And recently, the fish have all gone away, presumably because no female sacrifice was given. Additionally, we even see the old ritual that was performed for Godzilla as well. However, the depictions of Godzilla with the masks and the villagers are different than Godzilla itself, representing a different creature. So here's what I began to wonder. We know as an audience that the fish are dying because of the radiation that Godzilla is giving off. We also know that the creation of Godzilla was due to the atomic testing that was done off of the coast of Oda Island, which leads me to a few things to speculate on. Either A, the people of Oda Island really do know Godzilla and it did survive off of human sacrifices, just in a smaller form and was changed by human interaction due to atomic testing, thus resulting in the fish dying off, more so than the lack of the human sacrifices, and now that the creature is just pissed. Or B, the people of Oda Island are referring to a completely different creature, and the name of Gojira was given to this monster based off the experience these people had with a different creature, whose namesake is now given to this one. Or C, the creature they're referring to is a completely made up creature, something that serves more so as a folktale, serving as more of a godlike figure that they appease as islanders, which would also mean that they've sacrificed many women throughout the years for a cryptid like figure, and now Godzilla has just come along to inherit the namesake. I feel like I'm more inclined to believe option B. And the reason I do is because we establish in later films that this world will continue on in subsequent titles. Not only will Godzilla appear in these, but other creatures aside from Godzilla also will, with some even being from space. So, if that's the case, then that would mean that Godzilla was created throughout the atomic testing process and human interaction, but other creatures like it were already inhabiting this world many years ago and are now awakening either due to atomic testing or Godzilla's existence, thus resulting in the separate creature that was here on Oda Island. If not, then option C would be correct, meaning that many have died over the years for a folktale or fear of what may lie beneath the water of Oda Island. I'm telling you, man, just a few lines from this old man leads to a massive amount of speculation for lore and really gives the viewer questions as to what the world building of this setting could be. It's crazy. Anyway, tangent aside, as we continue, we begin to see the first parallels to the dropping of the atomic bomb and its effects on the radiation on civilization. In the aftermath of this destruction, Oda Island is torn apart. Not only do we see many townspeople without homes, but we see them aimless, having everything taken away from them, their land, their home, their job, just making this place uninhabitable. This point is even furthered by having the islanders discuss how their water supply has also been irradiated, much like the footprint on their shores, making their only source of drinking water inedible. I know that this film didn't need to take the time to tell us this, but I'm glad that it does. Not only does it flesh out the effects of this mysterious devastation, but it lets us see firsthand what this experience is like. Furthermore, this insurmountable destruction goes on to put pressure onto these islanders, forcing them to move away and trek across the mountains when all of a sudden, Godzilla appears. This monster is terrifying. I love how this Godzilla is presented, being a gargantuan force of insurmountable proportions. Not only is he as big as a mountain, but he is so indifferent to these citizens, viewing them as nothing but pests on this island as he continues his assured destruction. Furthermore, I really love the reaction of the cast and the extras. There is genuine fear that is being presented here, and you can feel that panic. It is incredibly palpable. Additionally, I know Godzilla is just a person in a suit, but I love the look of this creature. It's presented as something from the depths of the Earth's deepest uninhabitable hole. He genuinely looks scary here, but I'll talk more about him in the monster section of this video. After this excursion to Oda Island, we get Yamai meeting up with the Japanese government to discuss his findings while on Oda Island. And I have to say, this scene impressed the shit out of me. Not because it had huge revelations or astounding effects, but for 1950, I was so surprised at the seriousness and weight that this conversation had as to how a being like Godzilla could even exist in the first place. Not only is Godzilla treated as something serious, but the scientific discussion that is being had as to how a creature of insurmountable proportions can exist was so wonderful to see. It was great to see my favorite monster be treated with such respect and seriousness, making the weight and threat of this creature much more palpable, in addition to keeping Godzilla as this looming threat that will be encountered again. Additionally, it keeps the discussion of the H-bombs and the effect of the war at the forefront of the film, being the very thing that created Godzilla and still serving as a huge shadow that the entire country of Japan is living in. It works great from a foreshadowing perspective, but it also keeps the tension of the events to come too. I loved it. And speaking of tension, we get a mention that Godzilla may be heading for a place that is much closer than Oda Island, Tokyo. And with that foreshadowing, later that night, that's exactly what we get. Having Godzilla emerge from Tokyo Bay, surviving a depth charge attack and descending back into the ocean, buying time for another day. I really love the way Godzilla is represented here. And again, I'll dive deeper into it when the discussion comes in the monster section, but I gotta build up that tension, just like Godzilla does. After this night of terror and anxiety continues to build, we meet up with Emiko to meet Dr. Shirazawa, where Emiko has brought a reporter to speak with Dr. Shirazawa about a new invention that he is making that could eliminate Godzilla. However, instead of learning what that invention is, we actually dive deeper into the characters' relationships here, and learn that these two were to be married, but Emiko only views Shirazawa as a brother, and is genuinely in love with Ogata. Damn, my man literally got friend-zoned. However, despite not telling the reporter about his invention, Shirazawa does inform Emiko about it, asking her to promise that she does not share this information with anyone. And as he begins to show her what that invention is, just like Shikichi, we watch as Emiko is horrified, watching the horror on her face and viewing something that we cannot see, but we know is evil, mirroring the horror of Godzilla, but this time being something humanity itself has created. Despite this weapon being something that may be able to end Godzilla, Shirazawa vows to keep it hidden, not wanting it to fall into the hands of humanity and creating something else that's evil, much like the bombs in the years past. It's that night, though, that humanity's life in Tokyo is about to be changed forever, as Godzilla finally comes ashore via Tokyo Bay again, laying waste to Tokyo for the first time. Not only are whole neighborhoods destroyed, but trains are too, leaving many displaced for this short-lived attack, but showing the destruction that Godzilla is capable of. Even here in this scene, we're still not given the full scope of what Godzilla can do, only getting small attacks again and again, teasing us that we're building up to a massive crescendo of horrifying proportions. In the wake of this attack, the Japanese government begins to take precautions in order to prepare for another attack, and in doing so, they gather tanks, artillery, and create a massive electric barrier all around Tokyo Bay. Now, I'll admit, this plan is a little cartoony, and the idea of electric barrier this big is a bit unbelievable. However, it's a movie about a gigantic dinosaur, so it's fine. And it's with the scene set, a city in evacuation, and a military ready to fight that we finally get our crescendo. Once again, Godzilla emerges, and this time with a vengeance. We start with the opposition greeting Godzilla at the electric barrier, expending every cost possible to stop him. We see the use of tanks, guns, bombs, and bullets, but all to no avail. With each shot that is fired, the morale continues to drop, registered on this creature as ineffective and fighting a battle with no winnable end. Not only does it take a full army to meet this creature, but it's going to take more than that in order to stop him. However, the one saving grace we have is the electric berry. He has broken through our defenses. In a matter of seconds, Godzilla breaks through every possible human defense force that was set up in order to stop him as the opposition. With sheer strength and size, he devastates any sort of defenses, plowing through the electrical towers with ease, and for the first time, displaying the infamous atomic breath. Here, the atomic breath is incredibly scary, being more of a gas or heat effect that instantly destroys anything in its path. It's less of a spectacle like later films make it, and more of a side effect as a result of horrible experimentation gone wrong. The devastation here is horrifying, watching as countless citizens run in fear or die as a result of the rampage. Buildings are destroyed, cars are crushed, lives are lost, and the city that many used to call home is set ablaze, becoming a wasteland and a husk of its former self. Not only is this devastation shown with no glory or spectacle, but it goes on for minutes, showing the horror in its entirety, mirroring an atomic bomb in slow motion. However, the final gut punch that this entire scenario finally comes at the tail end of its destruction, displaying a hopeless mother and her children as she looks on at a force that she cannot control and a fate that she cannot outrun. She is literally staring death in the face, full of fear and sadness, when she says the infamous lines, "We'll be joining your father in just a moment." This horrified and broke me when I watched it. Not only is this such a helpless and bleak situation, but this is what it must have been like, knowing you have nowhere to run and you're holding on to the only thing that you love the most, knowing that there is nothing, and I mean nothing, that you can do. This whole scene is terrifying and horrific in a way that is just unnatural, pulling no punches about the pain and destruction that Godzilla is causing, and not shying away from showing us the horrifying results. The aftermath of this devastation is overwhelming, leaving hospitals overrun and many displaced. Here we see Emiko at her peak, tending to many wounded patients and offering them any support that she can. We see many of the victims and the conditions they're in, viewing the lasting effects of what Godzilla has done and how it's changed all these people's lives forever. Not only does this offer us a further look into how this monster can destroy civilizations, but it's the very catalyst that breaks Emiko of Shirazawa's secret, telling Ogata what he's created and venturing with him to go retrieve it. Again, fantastic character writing. Once we get this meetup, we are met with the confrontation between the two past lovers that were destined to be married, finally ending up on opposite sides. You have Emiko, the one who is in support of humanity and saving it, and then you have Shirazawa, the one who is practically avoiding humanity and will not give up this weapon no matter what. These opposing ideals have been set up in such a fantastic way from earlier in the film. Not only are we with Emiko and rooting for her to retrieve this device in order to save humanity and stop Godzilla, but we can also understand the viewpoint of Shirazawa and the decision he's making because of these very same humans. It is such a wonderful piece of character writing from an early film, and I love seeing the way that it's handled. However, it's not Emiko that turns him, or even Ogata's physical tactics when trying to persuade him. Moreover, it's the message of longing for hope and peace that plays over the television that ends up turning him, showing him what is worth fighting for, no matter the cause. So, in doing this, Shirazawa agrees to use his invention, and thus we finally get the Oxygen Destroyer. Not only do we fully understand what this is right off the bat by name alone, but even we as an audience can understand why Shirazawa is so cautious to use this, not wanting himself to be forced to make more of this device or forced to have his research fall into the wrong hands. Once we reach the ending of our epic journey, we finally find ourselves at Tokyo Bay once again, being the epicenter for Godzilla's resurfacing. Once we're here, Shirazawa makes it known that he wants to be the one to dive and detonate the oxygen destroyer himself, so as to not have anyone mess it up or make a mistake. Ogata hesitantly agrees to this notion, seeing as Shirazawa has never dove before, but only on the notion that he can accompany him. Once we get to the bottom of Tokyo Bay, we finally find our slumbering creature, resting comfortably at the bottom of the bay with Shirazawa not far from the monster itself. Not only do we finally get our final showdown between man and creature, but we also get a thematic showdown between man's PTSD against war and the very thing that was created because of it. Additionally, this also gives us a great sense of irony too. Having man once again create something that can be an earth-shattering weapon, but wielding it against another that was created from a weapon like it in the first place. This scene is very tense and narratively focused, full of wonderful hints of symbolism and storytelling that I love every second of it. However, as the oxygen destroyer is going off and we see the effects of it working, we come to the solution that Shirazawa was only planning on making this a one-way trip, wishing a wonderful love for Emiko and Ogata, going on to cut his oxygen cord and dying with the monster and his research in the process. Not only is this ending sad, but it also leaves a level of hope with the viewer, understanding that these are the mistakes of war and the result of the weapons of it, but also how there are still others who are willing to fight for humanity's survival, whatever the cost. It makes the character of Shirazawa so selfless, not only for his friends, but for his country and the world as a whole. And as we see our saddened reactions from our main cast of characters, Dr. Yamaya utters the notion that this may be far from over, seeing as this Godzilla may be a byproduct of war, and others like it may still exist if this sort of nuclear activity continues, firmly putting over that just because the battle for humanity is won, the war for it is still far, far from over. And with that, we bring a close to 1954's Godzilla. What a movie, am I right? Not only does it have a wonderful story and storytelling elements, but a fearsome creature as well. And speaking of that creature, let's talk about the monster. Not only is Godzilla presented in a way that is fearsome, but his actions are as well. There is no motive behind this creature and no great desire of what it's after, just pure survival. An apex predator that's finally standing above humanity and expressing that power in any possible way. Additionally, I love the look as well. Not only is this one of my favorites, but it works for the movie and the time period it was presented. This creature is supposed to be something that was created through the use of atomic war, something that is not supposed to be, and something whose existence is an abomination, and oh boy, does it look the part. Not only is this creature not uniform, but it looks like something that came out of a terrible lab test gone wrong. We see this through its scaly dorsal fin-like pattern representing some prehistoric creatures, but morphing into this abomination from all of the atomic testing. Additionally, its eyes lack any emotion, displaying as lifeless, harboring a gaze over everything it can destroy, and nothing else, maintaining no emotion and no real sense of thought. Furthermore, the use of Godzilla's screen time is so effective, only being used in small amounts of screen time and ramping up the destruction over time. It really is a horrific display in what an atomic bomb would be like in slow motion, starting off small until it eventually wipes away everything that stands in its path. Not only is this creature's design iconic, but I think it was great for the time, great for the movie, and was aided by the limited use and design back in 54. It's definitely one of my favorites, and I cannot wait to see how it stands up in subsequent film designs. Lastly, at the time of writing, I've gotten very deep into this series of films, and I can say that Godzilla is definitely done best when representing something bigger than himself, as if he wasn't big already. And here that is definitely put on big time through the atomic war and bomb analogy. However, one thing I began to notice, and one thing that I'll cover in future videos, is that Godzilla's representation and symbolic use does change, in addition to the new monsters also representing something far greater than themselves as well. It's a fantastic thing to see, especially when it comes to how each of these beings affect humanity and what they represent to us. It's definitely going to be a fun concept to explore and one that I cannot wait to get into. And speaking of getting into things, let's talk about the music. If you're a fan of these movies and have not sat down and listened to the score of this film, do yourself a favor and do so at some point. Not only is this an experience in its own right, but it too tells a story, painting a picture of dread and tragedy, but still giving the listener glimpses of hope and humanity. It does such a fantastic job at giving you the tone of dread and despair, but masking it in mystery, just waiting for it to reveal itself. There's a few tracks I'd like to discuss here as they really stick out to me, and the first is the main title theme. Of course, we're all familiar with the iconic Godzilla theme, and if you're not, I'm sure you've heard it at least a few times by now. But what the main title theme does with this track in particular is so special to me and feels like a real encapsulation of everything. Not only do we start off with the stomping sounds of Godzilla as he is approaching, but it's building the tension of something horrifying coming our way, crescendoing itself with the roar of Godzilla itself, revealing to the listener the horrifying monstrosity this track worked so hard to build. However, as it continues, we transition into the classic Godzilla theme that we all know, and as I thought about this more, something struck me. Not only is this track iconic because it's totally different from anything else in the score, but it's really different as well, representing the hope that humanity possesses even in times of great despair. We see this as we transition throughout the score as well, having this same track play in the songs labeled Attack Godzilla and Repel Godzilla. It's such an iconic track and a light that's found in the darkness amongst most of these songs, painting a picture of vigor and strength amongst insurmountable odds. It's very good. However, speaking of that darkness, the next thing I'd like to discuss is the use of Godzilla's heavy footsteps and the deep, drawn out notes that play in any track that involves Godzilla. It does such a great job at being an auditory cue for the listener, associating this sound with one of caution and danger. And not only are these small cues, but oftentimes they are paired with these long, drawn out notes that accompany deep dread. And even if you haven't seen the film, you can just listen and understand what's happening. It's a presence that only radiates fear. However, despite Godzilla's song cues being the very thing that is supposed to display fear, they are not what scare me in the score. Moreover, I believe that there are two tracks that really hammer home the tone and feeling of this movie, and they are back to back. One named Oxygen Destroyer, and the other Devastated Tokyo. If you have not listened to these tracks, then I implore you, please go and check them out. If you don't listen to anything else, at least listen to the main title theme and then these two tracks. Not only does this give you the full feel and scope of what this movie's message is supposed to be, but it puts on a full audio display here, making you feel every note and every heartbreaking sound that's played. So let's start with Oxygen Destroyer. This track is appropriately named after the invention that was created in the film, a weapon of war that could devastate civilizations and reluctantly used by one of our heroes, Dr. Shirazawa. And not only does the track display this through the audio, but it makes you feel it too. The track itself starts out with the sounds of what I can only describe as anxiety, building up to an anticipation of something that I should be nervous about, only to send that feeling away completely with the sound of a loud bang, paralleling the explosion of this bomb, but symbolizing the nature of the atomic bomb. Not only is it short, leaving the listener no time to prepare for it, but the track goes on to play very long, drawn-out notes for its 3-minute duration, suffocating the viewer with this feeling of pain and sadness, much like Shirazawa's creation does the Godzilla and himself. It's a horrifyingly beautiful track that pulls no punches when showing the listener what a force like this can do, and includes them in on this fear of feeling and dread, putting the horrors of a people and the invention like this on full display. If that wasn't enough, the score doubles down on this feeling, going on to play Devastated Tokyo. If Oxygen Destroyer was us witnessing the nightmare, then Devastated Tokyo is living in the hell of its aftermath. This track not only sounds like a visual or something that should be played in a church, but you can tell that it was made for mourning, the mourning of a people and the devastation of a nation. Just like the last track, it does not shy away from letting the listener know what it's feeling, creating an auditory weight that is placed onto the listener and letting you feel every ounce of pain that was put into these notes. Furthermore, if that wasn't enough, it really drives home this point by letting you hear the horrifying screams of a child that has become displaced due to this devastation, letting their cries be heard in full and forcing the listener to listen to what I can only describe as a funeral that has happened in the blink of an eye. It is a heartbreaking track and one that shook me to my core, but one that really drives home the aftermath and effects of what this destruction must have been like for the Japanese citizens. Lastly, the score doesn't end on a happy note either, but more on a somber one. Yes, there is hope, and yes, the battle has been won, but at a great cost to countless lives throughout the film. And although the score itself is not one of joy or happiness, there is hope to find here, but a great display of fear as well. And I think that Akira Ifukube did a fantastic job at telling this film's story, but also his people's, letting them feel every ounce of emotion that he does, and giving its listeners just a tiny glimpse into the pain that he may have felt. So overall, what are my thoughts? Well, despite this film being significantly older than all the others, doesn't mean I want to judge it by separate merits. The stories themselves are timeless, and I want to keep each of them on an even playing field. So with that being said, I'm going to put this movie at an S tier. I think that its narrative, use of storytelling, lovable characters, score, and portrayal of destruction are fantastic, and it truly is a classic for all those reasons. This is a fantastic start to the franchise, and I'm looking forward to seeing what Godzilla Raids Again has to offer. So, go ahead and grab a refill of your favorite brew. But if you're returning, thank you so much for your continued support. Now, without any more time wasted on yapping, let's go ahead and fast forward to a year later and dive into 1955's Godzilla Raids Again. Godzilla Raids Again was directed by Motoyoshi Oda and was written by three writers this time. Those being Shigeru Kayama, the writer of the last film, Takeo Murata, who was also a writer on the last film, and Shigechi Hidaka, at least according to my research. Additionally, we have a new cast of characters and actors, with one particular actor that would also go on to be a staple in this series, that being Hiroshi Koizumi, whom we're going to see a lot in these subsequent films. And in this film, he plays Shoichi Tsukikoka. The other actors in this film are Setsuko Wakayama as Hidemi Yamaji, Minoru Chikaki as Koji Kobayashi, Takeshi Shimura as the returning Dr. Yamai, Masaru Shimizu as Dr. Takaroko, and finally Seguro Onada as the returning Captain Terazawa. Again, if I butchered any of those names, I am so sorry. I feel like the first film really set the tone for what Godzilla is supposed to be from a symbolic perspective. However, this film is what gave Godzilla and the overall franchise its character and the start to its campiness, supporting actors that would go on to become the face and emotional backbone of the Showa era itself, in addition to possessing characters who are a bit more campy and playful in their direction. We'll dive more into it as the video progresses and as the series continues, but there is definitely a change to this franchise, and it goes through several of these changes at several different points. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and discuss the characters. In this film, there are a lot of characters, but a lot of them are minor, and we only have a few major ones. And despite this notion, here in this film, there doesn't seem to be much for them to do, and less full circle moments for them on their journey as a character. Additionally, more screen time is also given to Godzilla, and not in the best way. This film makes him seem more like a character and less of a looming presence that represents the tragedy of a nation or past mistakes coming to haunt them. It's very strange and something that we'll discuss as we get further in. But despite this, though, our main characters are filled with lots of personality and flair, and none are as established as our main protagonist, Soichi Tsukikoka. Suichi is a fish scouting pilot for a cannery based out of Osaka. He is someone who is as suave as he is brave, in addition to having a love interest in one of the cannery's air traffic controllers, Hidemi Yamaji. Yamaji is an air traffic controller for the same fishing business that Suichi works for. Additionally, she and Suichi are love interests for each other, sharing a flirty but playful relationship throughout this entire film. I really like Wakayama's portrayal of this character and the sweet softness she possessed in this role. However, I just wish there was more for her to do in this role, and just more for this character in general. The first Godzilla did such a great job with Emiko and her role as a character in that film, but we'll discuss more on that later. Our next character is Koji Kobayashi, another pilot who works for the same fishing company and is a great friend to Shoichi. He is also romantically involved with another air traffic controller by the name of Mayuri, who is also a friend of Yamaji. Mayuri isn't a major character in this film, so I didn't include her on this list. However, I do feel a mention of her is necessary as she is seen a lot throughout this film. but doesn't do much outside of other than making conversation with Yamaji. Lastly, we have Dr. Yamai, serving as our lead expert in all things Godzilla and carrying his knowledge over from the first film. Coming with him is the returning Captain Teruzawa as well. They both have small scenes in this film and serve as the connective tissue for the first film, demonstrating the horrors that Godzilla has committed, in addition to giving the audience a glorified lore dump on all those experiences. They don't play much bigger roles than that, and they're just mainly here for that connective tissue purpose. And as much as I'd like to continue with the characters that are involved in this film, that's it. I mean, you have Godzilla and Anagiris as well, but they don't do much talking, let alone grow as characters. So for a sequel, we're already starting off pretty light in the protagonist department. However, despite that, let's see how each of these characters change and develop as we make our way through the plot. This film opens up with a great use of foreshadowing on its title card, giving us the classic Godzilla roar, but accompanying that with a different sound. One that is unfamiliar to the audience and something that we've never heard before. And not only does that leave us with questions, it also lets us know a new conclusion that at this time, Godzilla isn't alone. Now, immediately, I have questions. For starters, how is Godzilla alive? We literally see him die in the last film and turn into a skeleton at the bottom of the ocean. Additionally, if Godzilla is returning, then how are we going to beat him this time? Not only are we aware of the destruction he can cause, but Dr. Shirazawa, the only man with the solution to this monster sized problem, died along with Godzilla and the oxygen destroyer. And if Godzilla isn't alone this time, then surely we're in for utter destruction on a massive scale. Not only do I like this setup, but it is a great use of foreshadowing and intrigue for the viewer. And as we open up with our resident fishing pilot, Soichi. This film opens up with Shoichi flying over a body of water in order to scout out land for his fishing cannery and making conversation with our other two characters in Yamaji and Koji. Not only do these conversations give us a light into this relationship, but it also serves as a great building point to see where they go as the film continues to progress. Additionally, the character building here is done wonderfully as well, really letting the viewer care about each of these people and establishing them as solid relationships that have obviously been around for a while. Here we get to see Shoichi's playful nature with Koji and the friendship that they have built over the years, working this job together. However, we also see the sweet and flirty relationship that Shoichi and Yamaji have as well, being one that seems pure of heart and innocent, having each care about the other as they have a vested interest in each other. Not only is this a great way to build a character, but it makes us as the audience care about these characters and who they are as people, giving us a linchpin to hold onto as the plot continues to unfold. Shortly after this conversation, though, trouble strikes, as Koji's plane begins to have engine trouble, forcing him to make an emergency landing at the newly named place, Iwado Island. Not only is this island in the middle of the ocean, but it's an emergency landing that is unsafe, forcing Koji to land and hope for the best, having Soichi assist in hope that his friend Koji is still alive. For the second film out, I really like this start. It feels very different than the first Godzilla and takes more of a character focused approach instead of a tension built one. It's definitely a different approach that sticks out as it's doing its own thing, while also giving the characters depth and personality, giving them lives as people that are a part of this world rather than the world being centered around them. As we land at Iwado Island, we discover that Koji has survived. Thank God. Landing safely but having damage taken to his plane. However, while we're here, we end up hearing a noise that we are all too familiar with: the roaring of Godzilla. And the roaring of something new. It's revealed that we not only get our first glimpse of Godzilla, but our new creature as well, Anagiris, deadlocked in a fight to the death with each of them on this random island that our pilots have only had the misfortune of landing on. Okay, so a few things. First, I'm going to take a lot of shit for this, but the reveal of these two deadlocked in a conflict with each other is just so lackluster. Not only does it take away from any intrigue that was set up for the viewer during the title card, but it's also lacking any tension that was present in the first Godzilla film just a year earlier. It's as if the film says, "You're here for big scary monsters, right? Well, here you go." Additionally, I'm so sorry for this, but Anagiris is kind of a bitch. Not only is he getting his absolute ass handed to him by Godzilla, but this is the first time we ever see him, and he's portrayed as something that is both weaker than Godzilla and not a threat to him at all. Not only does this do a disservice to the creature, but it really lands like a wet fart in terms of scary monster introductions. However, it's with that our pilots escape Wado Island, departing back to Osaka to warn the government that Godzilla has returned, and everyone may be in grave danger. Once we get back to the government building, we are met with the return of Dr. Yamai, detailing the events in the first film and serving as a linchpin to the Godzilla response that Osaka is going to now have. Now, I do feel a certain type of way about this discussion and some of the things that are covered within it. However, I'll save that for after the scene. Here, Dr. Yamai shows us footage from the Tokyo incident, and it's just the first Godzilla film and the destruction that was caused in that movie. However, it also serves as a reminder to the viewer about what happened in that film, in addition to hyping up the threat of Godzilla itself. Furthermore, as the discussion continues, we begin to venture into how a being like Anagiris can even exist in the first place, in addition to there being a second Godzilla. Not only do I love this discussion and how it's handled, as it also mirrors what happens in the first Godzilla, but much like the first, it's treated with so much seriousness and steeped in prehistoric scientific research that it makes the weight and seriousness of the situation feel palpable, as it's treating as a scientific anomaly rather than a fantastical event. It's a lot of fun. Lastly, Dr. Yamai does establish that the first Godzilla did in fact die along with Dr. Shirazawa and his use of the oxygen destroyer, meaning that the first film's events are in fact canon to this one, but more on that in a second. So, as we begin to wrap up this meeting, Dr. Yamai suggests that a blackout should take place in Osaka when Godzilla begins to come ashore, so that it may seem like there is no light source present. Not only does he go on to say that Godzilla is sensitive to light, which is new, but goes on to suggest that flares should be used to lure it back into the ocean, leading it away from any populated area as to not relive the events of the first film. And that's our plan. Okay, so a bit of discussion about this. I feel like this is the fisherman from the first film all over again. Firstly, I love that the first Godzilla was shown at the meeting as a means to demonstrate the destructive capabilities of this being. However, if this event is indeed canon to this universe, then why would this footage be needed in the first place? If something like the destruction of Tokyo had occurred in this universe not that long ago, wouldn't that be national news? And wouldn't the destruction of the historical impact of that be known to the Osaka government? It just seems odd to me that something like that would need to take place and should already be a known thing. Furthermore, I really hate how the discussion of the creation of Godzilla 2 and Anagiris' existence was treated. Yes, we get that they were both created through the testing of the H-bombs, but that's all we get. It's more of a, oh yeah, that must have been a further product testing of the H-bombs, and then we move on. It feels very much like a hand wave and something I wish was explored deeper. Because not only is this being a literal direct clone of the walking nightmare in the first film, but now you're establishing there's two. So it just felt very lackluster and lazy to me. And another thing, I understand that Dr. Yamai does leave the door open at the end of the first film when saying that other beings like this could exist. So they kind of get away with it. But if that's the case, then shouldn't this have been another creature entirely and not Godzilla at all? Like, I get money and recognition, but it feels very ham-fisted and forced to fit this into the narrative when we literally watch the original creature die in front of us. Furthermore, my boy, Dr. Shirazawa, I know what he did at the end of the first film was the ultimate sacrifice, and he died for what he believed in. But having a direct clone of Godzilla again feels like it takes away from the impact of his death that he had when dealing with the first Godzilla. And not just that, but now you're telling me Godzilla is sensitive to light? We couldn't have done that in the first film? Now, granted, I know this is the second film, it's a sequel, but I just feel like it sort of spoils a few fantastic things that happened in the first movie, and I just don't like the way it feels. Anyway, let's get back to the plot. After this discussion, though, we are made aware that the Japanese Defense Force is going after Godzilla, but it's proving difficult to locate him when the unthinkable happens. Godzilla is heading to Osaka Bay. Unaware of this news, we are greeted with Shoichi and Yamaji during a night out in Osaka, having a beautiful time dancing to a wonderful jazz band. I really like this scene and the vibe it presents. It feels like such a great encapsulation of the time, and it's beautiful to see people interact and engage with each other. It just felt very pure and really captured the feeling of the time. However, it also serves as a fantastic build when it comes to furthering the relationship between Soichi and Yamaji as well, making the relationship feel palpable and feel lived in. However, halfway through the beautiful night, tragedy strikes. Godzilla has arrived in Osaka. Panic begins to ensue in Osaka, and that panic that is portrayed here is palpable. It feels like a very genuine reaction from the people of Osaka, and ones who may have heard of this creature from the Tokyo incident. Furthermore, it also feels believable and practical when the people are ordered to take shelter while the city commences the suggested blackout. It feels as though these people have learned from past events that have transpired and are taking the needed safety measures in order to survive. It's awesome. Additionally, the flares that Dr. Yamai suggested are sent out into the bay, and to everyone's surprise, it works. Godzilla begins to retreat into the ocean and away from Osaka Bay. The people of Osaka are saved! Or so we thought. Because during this operation, a random ass transport led the police on a chase and then crash into an oil refinery in spectacular fashion, creating a massive explosion during this blackout, leading Godzilla to return to Osaka. Okay. Hold on. Because I cannot tell you how hard I laughed at this scene. To make a random ass transport of convicts that crash into an oil refinery as the reason for Godzilla's return is hilarious to me. Not only does it make zero sense, but it has nothing, and I mean nothing, to do with the plot. I audibly laughed my ass off when they drove into the oil refinery. I had to pause it and rewatch it just to laugh some more. My exact note on this is the prisoner transport and subsequent chase was so silly and not needed. Additionally, I don't know how they crashed unless they were the world's shittiest drivers. I hate them. I hate that them crashing is the reason Godzilla returns. It is so silly to me. It feels forced. I, I, I don't know, man. It's just so funny to me. Anyway, with this, we get the return of Godzilla to Osaka, and he continues on this path of destruction. Only this time, it's Osaka and not Tokyo. I have thoughts on this, but I'll wait till the scene is over. Furthermore, Anagiris makes his return here as well, being attracted to the very same flares that were supposed to lure Godzilla away. I really like this idea and how this return was handled. Additionally, I really love the look and design of him too. He feels so distinct from Godzilla and he stands out on his own from a design perspective for sure. However, in personality, not so much. But I'll get to that here in a second. But with that return of both monsters and a citywide panic, we now have our newer union spot, Osaka. And as you can imagine, all hell breaks loose. having the Japanese defense force attempting to hold back the monsters, and the monsters attempting to destroy each other. And not only is Osaka destroyed in the process, but our wonderful random ass prisoners are too. Okay, so this is where I gotta stop because I have thoughts on this entire sequence of events. Firstly, what is the damn beef with these two? They are the definition of it's on site. We never get an explanation as to why they don't like each other or as to why they just can't coexist on this globe. Additionally, we only ever see them fight and nothing else. There is no interaction or fight for territory or anything, just straight hands from the jump. Speaking of, what are these fights? I mean, my man, I didn't need modern day combat or excellent clean choreography, but at least do your best to make these monsters feel like monsters and not the obvious man in a suit. Furthermore, why did you need to put these fights in 2 times speed? It looks like two toddlers fighting each other over who gets the last chicken nugget. Lastly, I'm going to say something really unpopular. And for as much as I like the inclusion and his design, Anagiris is a bitch. Not only does he not stand up or hold a candle to Godzilla in the slightest, but he never feels like an actual threat to him. Furthermore, my man was murdered. Murdered. Getting the absolute dog shit beat out of him by Godzilla. And he goes on to embarrass this man by crisping him up after his defeat, leaving him looking like an overcooked chicken. And you know that was personal. I mean, Anagiris was already defeated. There was no reason for Godzilla to do that. But he said, fuck it, we ball. And quite literally lit his ass on fire. Not only do I enjoy the raw nature and ruthlessness of this battle, having Godzilla actually kill another creature to show dominance and power, but the way it's done and the lack of buildup combined with the goofy nature of the fight just left me wanting more with this tone than what we got. Additionally, let's talk about the backdrop of this film, and by proxy, the film as a whole for a second. The entire time I was watching this film, I couldn't help but feel lacking, like there was something missing. I couldn't shake the feeling, but eventually I came to the conclusion of my feelings in more of a question, and that being, did we really need this movie? Don't get me wrong, I love Godzilla. I love what he symbolizes, and I love how he gets used throughout his filmography. I love his design, I love the character traits, but here, none of that feels present. The first film gave us this horrifying look into a creature that was created by man's worst sins, showing us what the ramifications of that creature were, in addition to showing us every horrifying step. That film had weight and a message that it wanted to get across to the audience, despite using a gigantic dinosaur to do it. However, here, this film doesn't feel like that. It feels like Toho kept the dinosaur aspect of it, but got rid of everything else. And not only do I feel like that in its story, but I feel like that with the backdrop of Osaka as well. And look, I understand that Tokyo is Japan's most recognizable city and a famous landmark upon the world stage. Osaka as well. However, Osaka's presence here feels more like it was just put in so destruction could happen to Japan's other major city as well, and nothing else. It just feels so lacking in weight and scope, focusing more on the big scary monsters and destruction rather than telling a good story. It's something that really bothers me and left me a little disappointed in the end, going from something great to something lackluster. Despite this, though, the narrative continues, and Godzilla eventually leaves Osaka with the corpse of Anagiris behind, in addition to forcing our cast of characters into a precarious position, having to move north to the island of Hokkaido, continuing the fishing work there, which to me seems like a massive move to the entire different climate and part of the country, but I digress. However, it's here that our characters are finally at peace, with the Godzilla incident behind them, still feeling jaded at the entire situation, but moving on with their lives and continuing to work on their relationship. In addition to Shoichi's friend Kobayashi hinting at Hidemi that he has also fallen in love with her. Things are good in Hokkaido, cold, but good. When all of a sudden, just like before, all of our lives are interrupted again by the news that Godzilla has sunken another ship. Godzilla is here in Hokkaido. Once our characters locate Godzilla, they spring into action, doing all they can to distract and take him down in order to keep the country safe, keeping the memory of Osaka at the forefront of their minds while they continue to do so. However, within these maneuvers, tragedy strikes. As Kobayashi's plane is hit by Godzilla, he is sent screaming into the mountain of ice, crashing his plane and losing his life. Not only does this anger Shoichi, but it gives him an opening, as Kobayashi's plane is the very thing that brings an avalanche of ice onto Godzilla, serving as our last hurrah and giving the humans the opportunity they need to bury Godzilla under the ice, presumably forever. And they do just that. Before we end this film, the Japanese Defense Force, in addition to Soichi, go on to attack Godzilla and bury him in ice. And oh boy, if I had $1 for every cut to an explosion of ice falling onto Godzilla, I would be a millionaire. There are so many, and I mean so many cuts to ice just exploding as it begins to fall onto Godzilla. I'm pretty sure this scene went on for like at least 10 minutes. It's just absurd for how long the scene is. However, despite this though, we finally have reached our end as Shoichi flies off heading back to Hokkaido, reassuring Kobayashi's soul that they have finally defeated Godzilla. At least until the next film when he supposedly escapes the ice and fights Kong, but I don't know what happens in that film because again I can't find it anywhere on streaming, that is. I don't know. I may just have to buy it. So, with all this being done and over with, how do I feel? Well, if you can't tell by the tone of this section of the video, I'm kind of disappointed, to be honest with you. As I discussed earlier, not only is the story lacking in any symbolism or greater use of Godzilla, but it felt like the film was made to see big monsters fighting in Japan's other major city, and that's it. I felt as though there could have been more that happens with the revitalization of Godzilla, and maybe the previous characters are involved as well, scrambling to figure out what to do after the death of Shirazawa, using Godzilla as a form of PTSD for the last film's events. It just felt like a real missed opportunity that could have led to a great story being derived from it. Despite this, though, how are the stars of this film? The monsters. I'm going to break this section up into two separate sections, one for Anagiris and one for Godzilla. And I want to start with Anagiris, so let's jump in. Anagiris is a much welcome newcomer to this film. He is another species that was affected by the atomic radiation as well, awakening him from deep below the earth and giving him life in this gargantuan form, just as it did Godzilla. I really like the idea that the other creatures were affected by this too, and Godzilla isn't just the one off. I say that within the context of this being the same Godzilla, despite it not being the same Godzilla. Not only does this add to the world building, but it gives the impression that the tests have never stopped, or that they were so massive in scope and on such a massive scale that they ended up affecting these creatures all over. I also love that the look is visually different and sounds so different from Godzilla. I can see how it could be easy to create a creature that is the stark parallel of your star monster, and I'm also aware of how easy that would be for Toho at the time, considering that Godzilla was not CG, but more so a man in a suit on set underneath hot lights and long days of shooting. So I commend Toho for not only designing something so different, but something that is drastically different that I cannot imagine the time and manpower it took to design this creature in the first place. Additionally, despite my feelings on Anagiris, his design and sound is iconic. That cannot be argued with. Not only do I know exactly who this creature is as soon as I hear it, but it is so distinct that it sticks out as a mainstay sound in my head. But I also gotta thank Destroy All Monsters Melee for that as well. My only gripe with him is that I wish we would have gotten more screen time with him and more of a motive for him. Not only does he pale in comparison to Godzilla throughout the entire film, but he never feels like a threat and is always one step behind. I wish Toho made him more of a formidable opponent, or at the very least, made him a creature that was invading Godzilla's territory, making him an opponent for the Atomic Lizard in that regard. Hell, you could have even made him a good guy in something akin to the Guardian of Osaka, awakening after thousands of years and here to face man's biggest sin. I just feel like there was more that you could have done with him, but instead he just ended up as a piece of takoyaki on the lawn of Osaka Castle. So that's cool. But let's go ahead and move on to Godzilla. I feel like Godzilla was done so strangely in this film. Firstly, why did we make him quote unquote another Godzilla? Like, we know you killed Godzilla in the last film. We literally watched him die. But why didn't you just have some explanation for his revival instead? Something akin to the atomic radiation was continued so much that it began to rebuild the monster on a molecular level. Or something like Godzilla will always return and cannot die, but can only be stopped for a time. I feel like anything would have been better than having this be a separate creature. Because yes, it is treated as a hand wave, but also the audience isn't dumb. We know that this is the actual Godzilla, just ham fisted as a clone into this narrative. It's just a strange notion to me. And on top of the fact that the suit also looks so different, and oh boy, is he ugly, and not in a good way. I know the first film had a funky looking Godzilla suit, but that felt more in line with the way the film was presented as a being that was not supposed to exist, a creature created by man's misdoing and is now in this form that we see him. However, here it's 100% a man in a suit, and the neck and face sure do make that prevalent. It scares me more than the actual film does. However, one thing I do like about this Godzilla is the power and ruthlessness presented. Not only does the feeling carry over from the first film, but it feels in line with who Godzilla is, not caring about anyone or anything, just the power it possesses and the ruthless nature it demonstrates. I find that to be so cool and something that I feel gets a little rooted out in later films, so I enjoy that here. So, despite the film's miscomings and step away from the terror that Godzilla was in the first, there are some ideas presented that I did enjoy, and ones that I would love to see down the road. And before we wrap up, let's go ahead and put the cherry on top of this cake and discuss this movie's score. Not only was this movie directed by someone different, it was also scored by another person as well, being Masaru Sato, who is the name of a person you'll recognize as the time goes on, but who is also a person who scored acclaimed films like Yojimbo. While listening to this album, two things became very apparent to me. One, this score doesn't really tell much of a story like the last one did, but more so always possessed this feeling of dread throughout its entirety. And two, a lot of tracks use deep, guttural notes in each of their songs, making a ton of the tracks feel like a slog or evoking the feeling of impending doom. My favorite track on this score, and one that evokes this feeling the best, is Flares and Godzilla, coming in at a pivotal moment of tension in this film, having the entire city of Osaka on edge, and you could feel that in the track. Not only does this track feel like tension personified, but it feels like someone holding their breath, not wanting to make a single sound for the fear of something terrible may happen. Additionally, this is followed up by a wonderful track that complements it called Scarlet Chain Reaction, having that terrible thing finally come to light and the danger making itself known. It is a great use of tension when going from tension to fear, and you could audibly hear that throughout. Other than this though, I thought the score was okay. I did enjoy it, but not as much as this first score having us tell a story through each track. And despite not being a huge fan of this score, I still think that this one and the original complement each other very well. Having the first detail the emotional story of the film and a feeling of pain, sadness, and fear, while this one keeps the feeling of dread throughout. I think as a package deal, it fits beautifully, but as a standalone, I think the original score vastly outdoes this one. So, as a sequel, much like many sequels, I don't think this one outdoes the original. However, I really did enjoy the characters, introduction of a new monster, the world building that it presents, and leading us to better ideas that are down the road, I'm sure. But with that being said, though, I think I would rank this film as a high C tier, being a great film that harbors many fun new moments, concepts, and characters, but lacks any real story significance or symbolism. I just didn't really enjoy it. But if you do, that's great. Perfect. Enjoy this film all you want. It just wasn't for me. But with that being said, we're closing up today. So join me next time when we become acquainted with our two adjacent kaiju, Rodan and Mothra, for a bombastic double feature that represents its own message while also standing adjacent and against Godzilla. But remember, take life one cup at a time. I'll see you guys later.